Okay, here's the beginning part of the PowerPoint lecture on the origins or roots of sociology. We're going to talk a little bit about the beginning of sociology and a little bit about some of the founding fathers. We're going to start talking about the idea of science. Now, sociology has struggled to be recognized as a science for some time, especially early on when sociology was just getting it started in the 1700s. A science is a systematic and standardized way of investigating phenomena in the social and or natural worlds. So if something is scientific, that implies a systematic and a standardized way of looking at things. If something is systematic, that implies a specific way or method in which something is carried out. If something is standardized, that means something is done or carried out exactly the same way every single time. So if I give an attitude survey on, let's say, premarital sex, I want to know what your attitudes as high school students as a group are. I should probably give the same questionnaire with the same questions, give it out the same way, score it the same way. Otherwise, I'm going to get very inconsistent results. If I give different questions or give you different forms of the questionnaire from one class to the next or from one school to the next, I'm not going to get very good information. So sociology strives to be objective as possible, and scientific. Science attempts to explain why things happen. This next, or the second goal of science, is to make generalizations, and your textbook talks about these as well, and you'll want to keep up with your readings in chapter 1, especially right now, with what we're talking about here. A generalization is a statement that goes beyond the individual case and is applied to a broader group or situation. For example, a sociologist wants to explain not only why Brandon, that's me, went to college, but why people with Brandon's characteristics are more likely than others to attend college. So we look for these generalizations. Now, did I go to college because I'm smarter or because I'm more motivated than the average high school student? No, not at all. It just so happens that I share characteristics with other college students in my area. I happen to have been living in a middle-class neighborhood with parents who stressed education and the importance of education, especially college, higher education. So those values were instilled, as opposed to people who live in poor parts of the country, or maybe even in inner cities where education is simply not a priority. So there I am graduating from college. Yay me. Another example of a generalization, I'm going to change the name of the gentleman to protect him. We'll call him Paul. A sociologist wants to explain not only why Paul went to jail for selling drugs, but why people with Paul's characteristics are more likely than others to go to jail. Actually, one of my best friends, we're going to say his name was Paul, grew up in a situation that led him to make some decisions that were unfortunate. We'll come back to that in just a second. So we're talking about these generalizations. If we can recognize patterns, we look for patterns in these generalizations. And patterns are recurring characteristics or events. If we can identify these patterns, then we can make reasonable predictions about what will happen in the future for people. A prediction is a specification in light of current knowledge about what will happen in the future. So if I recognize patterns, we'll go back to Paul, for example. This is a true story about a friend of mine from my childhood days. He grew up literally in poor inner city Philadelphia. So we're going to look for a generalization, but we're going to look for the patterns first. He grew up in the inner city. He grew up with very little, if any, parental supervision. His parents used and sold drugs. Paul was very poor throughout his growing up years, throughout his formative years. Education was certainly not encouraged by his family, and the economic opportunities in his neighborhood were extremely limited, shall we say non-existent. And all of his friends and associates sold drugs and alcohol. So you can reasonably predict in his situation why he may turn to using and selling drugs. And we would have conversations about this, and he would say to me, Brandon, I'm just as smart as you, and he is, and he was. But I just didn't have the opportunities. The high schools were terrible. Teachers didn't want to come to school because there was crime, all around. Drugs were everywhere. There were no economic opportunities. The cards were the deck was stacked against him. And that's not to justify his behavior, and he wouldn't do that either. But we start to see these patterns. That's what I'm getting at. And we can make the generalization, start to predict why someone may or may not be a college graduate or a drug dealer. Now, we move on to the history of sociology a bit here. Our founding father was a gentleman by the name of Auguste Comte. And Comte is discussed in your textbook. I just thought that was kind of cool, so I put that on there. Keep calm, party with a sociologist. Right, okay. Well, anyway, give you some facts about Comte. A lot of these guys that we talk about, men and women who were important in the history of sociology, had a lot of really good ideas, but also had some pretty negative things or some adversity that they had to overcome. Comte was brilliant, but he also had a mental breakdown. He never had much money. He had never had much of an audience or a following. A lot like the other sociologists we're going to talk about soon, he was other things. He was also a mathematician and a philosopher. He was often marginalized by his intellectual peers. Some important facts we'll discuss with reference to Comte, and these are in your book. He was our founder. He also talked about a concept known as positivism. He studied social statics and social dynamics, and also realized that language and religion were the glues that would hold society together. So we'll talk about some of his ideas here. The idea of positivism. With Comte, we have to realize that he grew up during the time of the French Revolution. He witnessed something like 7 or 8 political regime changes, often very bloody regime changes. He witnessed the public execution of the King and Queen of France during the French Revolution. So he saw a lot of upheaval, a lot of turmoil in his life. And he began to wonder exactly what it is or was that held society together. His idea of positivism, the idea that what we really know and can understand about the world really comes through our senses. We could observe objectively, measure objectively, rather, what we can observe through our senses. And that was his idea of positivism. He came to the realization that just as the scientific method had revealed the law of gravity, so too could the scientific method uncover the laws that predict or guide society. So you have the scientific method, which is discussed in your book. We'll get into that some more too. That set out and predict natural things, natural laws. But also you can use the scientific method, observation, repetition, testing, etc., to predict things that happen in society with people. The scientific method, it's a method of procedure that has characterized the natural sciences since the 1600s or the 17th century, consisting of systematic observation, measurement, experimentation, and the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses. And then we get into theories and all that good stuff that we'll talk about later. Now, common sense can get us into trouble. That's why in the social sciences, specifically sociology here, we tend to shy away from common sense. Sometimes things that we assume to be true or think that we know are true actually are not. So we want to test, we want to research, we want to replicate our data or our information to get consistent results. Let's take a common sense quiz. This is in your textbook, by the way, in case you're wondering. 9 true-false questions. You can stop this. I'm not going to read them to you and insult your intelligence. But you can kind of pause and read it and just kind of come up with an idea of what you think the answers are to these questions. And there's 6 through 9. You may think you know the answers to these. So after you've paused this, you've thought about it, they're your answers. They're all false. And the explanations are on page 8 in your textbook. Wow. So you think more U.S. students are killed in high school shootings now than 15 years ago, number 1. It might be easy to think this is true because the media saturates us with story after story of school violence and shootings in schools, and we think it's got to be happening more now than it was 15, 20, 30, 50 years ago, when actually it's false. It's more dangerous, number 4, to walk near topless bars than fast food restaurants. You might think, well, yeah, that's true. Really, it's not. It's more dangerous to walk by fast food restaurants. So, and we start to understand why. Number 8, compared with women, men make more eye-to-eye contact in face-to-face conversations. A lot of people think, well, that's true. Men are more assertive, they're dominant, they take charge and women are more passive and docile, and that's a false statement. Then we start to understand when you look at, and there it is in case you don't have your book in front of you, some of the explanations for these answers, and you can pause this and kind of look at it, or you can look at it in your textbook. And we'll call that the end of this part. Thanks.